Okay, so I'll start then. So I want to begin today by congratulating you, Mike, on the forthcoming career award from the International Public Policy Association. It's a really well-deserved recognition of your outstanding contribution to the fields of public policy and public admin through your scholarly publications and your exceptional service to the profession. And there's no doubt about it that you are a highly prolific and important publisher, and you have made significant contributions to the conceptualization of the policymaking process, including most recently through your theorization of the role of policy tools and policy advisory systems, and this very, very interesting literature on policy design. And it's likewise an outstanding contribution in terms of the international development of the public policy and public administration field and profession. You were a founding vice president of the International Public Policy Association. You've helped to build public policy networks in Canada and Asia. And I know that you've been an editor or editorial board member of multiple scholarly presses and journals. And this is just truly a remarkable contribution over the past 35 years or so. So today, we have some questions for you about your career. We'd like to hear from you about how you see your own career. And I'm going to turn it over to Gilberto now to begin our conversation with the
Yes,
question.
I will start from your background because checking your CV, I realized that your academic journey have taken some twists and turns in the sense that I discovered that your bachelor dissertation was on Chinese educational policy, the role of dialectics in Chinese. And I was like, okay. And then in the master, you did something, final dissertation in international relations. And then in the PhD, you focused on Canadian forest policy. So the point is that when and how you discover public policy, because the first, let's say, track was the bachelor was in something more philosophical, apparently, because where there is dialectics means philosophy, at least. eh? Then international relations, unexpected to me, I have to say, and then Canadian forestry policy. So what happened at a certain point? When and why, how you decided to focus more on public policy?
Well, thanks, Grace, for those comments and compliments. Yeah, it has been sort of a long, strange trip, as they say. The MA that Gilberto was talking about actually was it wasn't international relations; it was intergovernmental relations, and so it was looking sort of relations inside Canadian federalism. I mean, I was always really just interested in Canadian politics and public policy, but as Grace will know, in the mid '70s and into the early 1980s in Canada, there were no public policy programs to speak of. There were a couple of policy schools, but they were really kind of public admin schools, public management schools, like at Carleton or Queens had one that was started actually while I was there. But it was more of a federation of existing research units rather than what we would call a kind of standard policy school now. So I think what I was doing was fairly typical of what many people in Canada would have done if they were interested in public policy. And especially if they didn't want to go to the US or get involved in US schools. I was really interested in the Canadian situation. And so I wanted to go to school in Canada. I went to the University of Ottawa mainly because it was bilingual at the time, but also because, it was in the nation's capital and they had a very good system. I don't know if they have it anymore, but of sort of credit transfer between Carleton University and the University of Ottawa. So in fact, it was kind of a very big university, if you think of it as a single kind of unit in the nation's capital. The thing about the Chinese Communist Party, that was something that I just kind of, sort of eased into. There was a faculty member at the University of Ottawa at the time, Bill Badur, who became the dean there. And I was very impressed with him. Now, this was a very interesting time, of course. This was just after the Cultural Revolution, the Gang of Four, everything else. So, I mean, it was very interesting, obviously, in the news. But what I really liked about him was that he was very kind of precise and dedicated, and was very interested in what we would now call sort of Chinese policy processes. At the time, of course, I didn't have any money. I remember going to him one day and saying, I need some money for rent and so on. And, have you got anything? And he had a research program going, which was looking at the nomenclatura system inside the Chinese Communist Party. So I spent a good part of 2 summers going through dictionaries of Chinese biographies, looking up and doing, little recipe cards with information on individuals in the Chinese Politburo and Presidium and everything else. Anyway, one thing led to another, and he was interested in kind of supervising people and theses. And I had written a paper for a class that he had done on Chinese educational policy, and so kind of just sort of went in that direction for what is really a kind of honors thesis at the time. But that was a little bit of a deviation, and what I was really interested in was mainly the Canadian material. And when I went and I was working up in Northwest BC after I graduated as a reporter, and it was a very interesting time because it was much sort of as it is now, in the sense that it was, in the aftermath of the oil shocks of the late 70s. So Canada was developing a new energy strategy. The National Energy Program was coming out and so on. And just like now, many of the big projects were dedicated to Northwest BC, right? So, new oil ports, new petrochemical plants, LNG plants, plus some mining activity and a lot of other things. So we were working for, a very small paper in the Terrace kind of Prince Rupert area, which normally would have been pretty much a backwater, but at the time was just buzzing with all kinds of activity, multi-billion-dollar projects underway. All kinds of people and companies flying around and floating around from, Japan and China and elsewhere, Americans, Canadians, trying to get these things going. And we had a kind of front row seat on that because, of course, they had to go through local environmental processes and hearings and things like that. And we would cover all of those things and then feed that to things like the Globe and Mail, Vancouver Sun, and so on. So that kind of sharpened my interest in the Canadian aspects and the natural resource aspects of Canadian policymaking. And I went back to UBC, and that's why I did this project on the administrative relationships between British Columbia and Ottawa, which, as Grace will know, most people don't know very much about Canada. They know even less about British Columbia, and they know even less about the relationships between them. And nobody had done that before, and I did that. It turned out that a colleague who I met there, who was, had a very significant influence on what I've done, was M. Ramesh. He was there doing his PhD at the time, and he had worked on a similar project, intergovernmental relations, in Saskatchewan, where he had gone after coming to Canada from India. So we had a lot in common and a lot to discuss and so on. Following that, I went to Queens. I went back to Queens. There I was working with Richard Simeon. Grace will know Richard is kind of a pivotal figure in the development of public policy studies in Canada. To a certain extent, what he was doing was kind of importing into Canada some of the literature that he had picked up on in the US. He had gone to Yale and had brought some of that to the Canadian context. And I had worked in the forest sector before. Prior to going to the University of Ottawa, I'd worked in sawmills and pulp mills and all kinds of things. This was an interesting area because it was kind of a collapsing industry in the sense that it was finally being sort of logged out, and the timber supply was decreasing. And there were all sorts of questions about what do you do about that, given the fact that prior to that period, it had been really one of the largest industries in Canada in many provinces and many areas outside of the major, metropolises like Montreal and Toronto. So Richard was interested in that. I was interested in that, and I did a thesis there. Again, I think that's fairly typical in the Canadian case. I mean, Grace probably had a very similar kind of experience working in an area like agriculture and so on, and coming at it kind of sectorally and through a sort of institutional lens, studies on federalism and the institutional structure and processes in Canada, rather than doing a sort of U.S. style or what we would now think of as being a kind of public policy analysis. The question about, when did I really start thinking about this in sort of those kind of U.S. style public policy terms? It was probably when I was at the University of Victoria after I graduated from Queen's, and I bumped into Colin Bennett, and he had just got hired at UVic from the University of Illinois. And I remember talking to him one time at over lunch at the faculty club at UVic, and I was trying to describe what I had found in my PhD thesis, and he immediately just kind of said, "Oh, well, that's a kind of agenda setting, formulation study, and so on of the U.S." Which at the time I really had heard none of that. I didn't realize that really that was what I was doing. I realized then that there was a whole sort of universe of literature that had been there, that was in place, had been in place, since the 1950s in the US. And so I started to look into that. And Colin was interested at the time in privacy laws and had been working with Richard Rose in Scotland on lesson drawing and policy learning using the experience of the diffusion of privacy laws and freedom of information, access to information laws around the globe. And we started to think kind of generically about that and started to publish in that area, which turns out to have been a very popular paper in the early 90s on kind of the lessons of learning, what is policy learning all about, and so on. So that would have been, for me, the kind of transitionary moment, if you will, from doing this kind of typical kind of Canadian institutional political economy type work to thinking about it more in terms of, concepts and theories and so on that had been developed in the US. As it turned out, other people, of course, were doing the same thing. And there was some very interesting work coming out at the time. Grace was involved in some of it. Atkinson and Coleman's book, for instance, on industrial policy in Canada, that fit right into some of that thinking. And then the book, Grace, that the edited book that you and I guess Bill and Michael did on policy communities and policy networks in Canada was really pretty pivotal, I think, and marked this kind of start, I think, of not a Canadian school of public policy, but of thinking about Canadian public policy along the lines that it was being done elsewhere, primarily in the US, but not exclusively at the time.
Okay, it took a bit. Okay, thanks a lot. It took a bit. It was a process. And talking about the world, you have been publishing with scholars belonging to different continents. North America, Asia, Europe. I don't know if also Latin America or Africa, but however, the number of your quotas is very, very internationalized. So, in your opinion, to what extent uh, the theories of public policy or policy design, our concepts that are Western based, can be really applied to other continents, especially Asia and Global South?
Well, this will be a very unpopular position, but I would say 100%. I don't see that difference between the kinds of things that are being studied in the Western context, and then those in other countries. I mean, obviously, things like level of development, policy capacity, levels of corruption, transparency, et cetera, vary uh, between regions and also, of course, between countries. But that's something that's always taken into account anyway, right? So when we're looking at a discussion about public policy making in Peru, it's going to be different from public policy making in Ecuador, and it's going to be different from public policy making in the UK or in Canada or elsewhere. But I think the whole idea about this sort of, I would call it this US inspired idea, but this policy analysis movement has the supposition or presupposition within it that there are some generic processes and that some of these variations are really just kind of parameters, and that can be taken into account and sort of controlled for. So, we wouldn't expect the identical policy to emerge in, say, social welfare policy in a country which is not corrupt versus a country that is corrupt, and the payments are all being taken off by the political parties and so on. But we can still talk about them as social policies, and we can still use the kind of concepts that we have around policy processes, things like policy capacity, administrative systems, governance systems, and so on, to say something about those different jurisdictions and those different policies. I mean, I think there's obviously a longer history to this, right? So it kind of goes back to the old discussions in political science around political culture and things like that. And I've always been very skeptical about those, going back to the kind of Almond and Powell, Almond and Verba things around political culture from the early 1970s and into the 1980s. I mean, if we abandon the idea of this kind of generic aspects or the ability to control for these kinds of variations, we'll all just be studying Confucian public policy. I mean, and looking at it in more and more detail. That was the problem in Asia, for instance. So, up until sometime around 2000 or maybe a little bit afterwards, those were the kinds of analyses that you used to get, right? So they would be very idiosyncratic. What's done in Thailand is different from what's done everywhere else. We have to look at the religious components and ethnic aspects and political processes in detail. The various configuration of actors in the party system and so on, and how they reflect those kinds of values in order to understand anything. And that was, I think, a problem, right? Because it meant that in many cases it was very difficult, if not impossible, to generalize across countries or to really draw or learn from one country's experience and apply it to another, because the assumption would always be that it doesn't really apply, or it's not going to work, or it has to be made to fit, and in doing that, it's going to ruin, what was there. I think after 2000, certainly in the Asian case, you get a new generation of people. They're trained mainly in the US, sometimes in Europe. They're going back. They're starting to staff not only the governments, but also the academic institutions and so on. And they are more interested in, again, these kind of general or generic concepts like policy subsystem, policy networks, policy capacity, policy advisory systems, and so on, and in being able to draw these comparisons and learn from each other, both conceptually and in practice. The only place where you can, I think, you sort of see some remnants of the old guard is really still in the PRC. And, every once in a while, you'll get somebody who will just dismiss anything that's done. We don't have to study advocacy coalitions. That's a Western concept. Doesn't apply in the Chinese case. But
And now there is a huge, there is an increasing of studies applying even the advocacy coalition. Let's call them the American framework to China. So if you check the last 3 or 4 years, you can see there is an increase. Also, Chinese people, I think exactly for what you have said, many people coming back from their PhD from US and then applying this. So I think that maybe also China now is covered. So you are not you are a bit biased with respect to the decolonize public policy, something of that.
yeah, state imperialist.
I suppose that as every Canadian. Okay, let's go ahead. Look, during your career, because you are still young, but after decades, you like some of us, you have seen all these waves of let's say new phenomena in public policy, new public management, governance theories, collaborative governance, and so on. So things that apparently have changed the public policy theories or public policy thinking, but not so much. Now we have this new thing that is artificial intelligence and related technologies. So, your opinion, what is your opinion about the challenge that these new, really new technologies, what kind of impact could have in the way through which we conceptualize not only I would say both public policy theories and especially policy design.
Well, yeah, this is the question du jour, right? But I, in terms of policy theory, I don't think it makes much difference or has much impact. A couple of years ago, there was a concern about misinformation and disinformation, so-called truthiness, and so on. And there was some questions at the time about whether that really undermined existing policy theory. And Ramesh and Anthony Pearl and I, kind of as an extension to some thinking around the textbook that we have, we're concerned about that because we're thinking, well, if it is changing things, we better start thinking about this, redoing this textbook, in a different way. And we sort of looked into it or thought about it really a bit. And we looked at some of the kind of dominant models or common models, advocacy coalition, multiple streams framework, and so on, used in the policy sciences, and asked, does the presence of misinformation, disinformation, does it really undermine those approaches, or is it in some way compatible with them? And the argument we made at the time was that those theories are kind of large enough and broad enough that you can think of the veracity of empirical facts and so on again as being kind of a parameter that can vary in the system. And of course, we've always had situations like most military dictatorships, or the former Soviet Union, or the current Russia, and so on, where there are propaganda systems in place, and the information either doesn't exist or it's manipulated, in different ways. And that really doesn't undermine the veracity of the advocacy coalition framework, or say its fundamental notions, that there is a subsystem, that the subsystem is held together by beliefs, and so on. It just means that the beliefs are different and the individuals are different and they act in a slightly different way. My suspicion is the same thing with AI. So, I think you have to distinguish between AI as a kind of technical, empirical tool, and then, potentially, possibly AI as a kind of philosophical mastermind, which will then, tell us the answer to all the questions that we've ever wanted to know. Um, my impression from using AI in the classroom and myself and in other areas is that it's nowhere near that level. So I had a graduate class last fall. We spent a fair amount of time seeing how the different AI models could be, applied for public policy research. This was an MA, PhD level class. And the conclusion that most people came to was that, the level that it's operating at is a kind of second year university student level. That is bad, really, better obviously than the average member of the public and so on, but really nowhere near, even an MA level student or a PhD level student. That shouldn't be that all that surprising for, an intelligence which is trained on Reddit, right? I mean, that's the kind of level of that we have for Reddit. So I don't think that that's in any way in its current form. I don't see it getting that much better in its current form being a kind of challenge to, or to thinkers, working on policy analysis or policy theory. But as an empirical tool, a lot more possibilities, right? Now, so far as I've seen, the question about whether AI can replace policy briefs, for instance, written by individuals or by analysts. Um, I've only seen 3 or 4 studies on that. They're sometimes using outdated AI, but the answers have always been the same, which is no, right? So, they usually try to have reports and briefs written by AI, and then they grade them in some way, have, human users and so on grade them. And generally speaking, the AI is found to be less useful, less accurate, and so on than reports done by skilled and experienced individuals in the field. However, when it comes to, for instance, data analysis, you can see the AI as being an extension of the sort of big data movement or big data, the emergence of big data in the kind of digital era over the past 10 or 20 years. And the problem, as we all know, from people who work with this, is that you have to somehow analyze the big data. And if you have, 1.5 million or 2 million Twitter or X, comments that you want to look at in terms of some kind of sentiment analysis or topic modeling and so on, well, doing that by hand is impossible, right? And it can't be done. But AI can do that, right? And can do it reasonably well, and can do it very quickly. Now, it's not just AI because, people have worked on different ways of kind of mechanizing social network analysis for some time and so on, and they're dealing with the same problem, which is a huge amount of empirical information that has to be somehow, read and synthesized and analyzed. And I think, that's where the AI comes in. And that is, I don't mean to denigrate that at all. I mean, that's a really major kind of development and something that's very useful in a wide variety of ways. I mean, you can see it today, for instance, in what the various news organizations have done with the Epstein files in the US. This is a massive dump of information that would have taken individuals decades to go through, but you can have a reasonably accurate report out within 3 or 4 hours of the material coming out using AI type search engines and so on forth. It's still kind of early days. I was just, in fact, this morning I was just watching a video out of Princeton, which was talking about doing web crawling using AI, which is something I'm interested in. You still need decent working knowledge of Python and so on at this point. I suspect, that will get better, faster, easier over the next little while, and that's something to really pay attention to. But as far as replacing individuals in thinking about and conceptualizing public policy making, I doubt it's ever going to get there.
May I add a small question to this more general question? You have been together with Vushun and Ramesh one of the proposal of the so-called policy capacity framework. And this, let's call it digital capacity that is really increased thanks to artificial intelligence, how can be included in that framework that so many scholars use? Is a different capacity or is simply something that should be included in the existing categories that you have proposed?
I think it would fit in most of them, right? So, if it's enhancing what the individual is doing, so it's really sort of individual analytical capacity. If it's a question of whether an organization has either the data banks that are required or the data access, or can train people to use it and so on, then it's really a function of kind of organizational capacity. So I wouldn't see it as being a separate uh, capacity element, but as being part of most of the other ones. I'm not sure about the political one, but most of the other ones.
Thank you. Maybe I think that now, Grace, so you could take the lead.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. So you are a leading scholar of the policy design theory, policy design literature, effective tools of policy design. But as far as I know, you've never worked in government. I don't know if this is a paradox or not, but how has not being a practitioner, someone working inside government, allowed you to offer what I think is an effort to be practical advice to governments?
Well, of course, that is a good question. I mean, I think I would take a kind of very academic look at that, or take on that. I would say, if you're interested in how, engineers act as a profession, you don't have to be an engineer, right? So, what you're really talking about is a kind of sociological methodology or a sort of anthropological methodology, and that's really what you need. So I don't think not having direct experience in government is necessary on the public policy front. But it depends what you're trying to do, right? And what sort of level of analysis or what kinds of analyses you're making and what you think the intention of them is. I think there's a bit of a problem in this. Well, we all know about Laswell's ideas about the kind of three elements of policy analysis, interdisciplinarity and so on. There's this question about his third category, I guess, around relevancy, right? And what exactly does that mean? In some cases, that's interpreted very narrowly to mean, generation of information which is directly relevant or applicable to, an existing problem, right? So that would be the kind of advice to people who are making decisions, the kind of speaking truth to power idea that Vildavsky had. But on the other hand, you can say, well, it doesn't have to be directly relevant to practitioners, and it doesn't have to, or directly applicable. And, the knowledge which is being generated doesn't have to necessarily apply to current problems, right? So it can apply to historical problems, it can apply to future problems, and so on. And those are areas that really academics are really well placed to study, and practitioners are not particularly well placed to do that. The famous Henry Ford comment about history is bunk and so on, which is a kind of common vision that you have, right? So I'm not all that interested in history. I'm interested in doing something now, and maybe that's not such a good thing, right? So maybe there should be more training and so on in these historical situations, and that's something that really academics should do, that policy schools can do. And somebody has to write the course material and write the course textbooks and so on for them to be able to do that. Lesson drawing, we talked about that before. Some civil servants or decision makers or whatever are well integrated in, say, international networks of different kinds, and so they're able to draw lessons themselves from what other jurisdictions are doing. And obviously, there's more of that now than there was, in the past, just given globalization and transportation ease and so on. However, a lot of them are not, right? And in which case, again, if they want to know, if you're in Canada and you want to know what's being done, not in the UK or something, but what's being done in Tanzania, uh, you're going to rely, or you may end up relying on academic research to do that. And the academics are really well placed, to do that kind of research. So again, I would say you have to be careful about what relevance means here, and I think too narrow an interpretation of what Lasswell's injunction, sort of does us a disservice. Another element to it, which is a bit peripheral, but I think is important, is um, not this kind of direct versus indirect aspect, but the this kind of limitations on the direct participation of academics in the policy realm. Andrea Mazzoni and Kathy Brock and I a couple of years ago did a number of studies on the participation of academics in Canadian public policy making, mainly at the federal level. And we had it sort of matched up with some of the findings that Peter May and others had done in the US, which was finding that there was only a very small kind of strata of academics who actually kind of went out of their way and participated heavily in this kind of formal decision-making processes, like appearing before parliamentary committees or appearing as expert witnesses in trials and so on. And we called that the kind of hyper users or hyper experts or super users, in that most academics didn't do that kind of work at all. Then of the smaller group which did do that, the vast majority of that did it maybe once or twice, and that was about it. But there was a small sliver which was appearing 20, 30, 40 times in various areas. And there are problems with that, right? In terms of sort of democratic processes and so on, because it's a question of why is it that these people are doing that, right? So is it that there's opportunities for them to do that? Is it that they have some particular expertise that the decision makers need? Or is it that they're saying things that decision makers like? So they'll just listen to it over and over again, and it's a kind of echo chamber that goes around and around and around. We suspect it's kind of a combination of all of those three things, but the echo chamber part is definitely a concern. So anyway, I mean, it would be useful. Sometimes I do wish that I had spent a bit more time possibly in government, but on the other hand, I think there's clearly a role for academic policy analysis and policy study, even for those people who haven't spent time as civil servants.
Yeah, you've convinced me. Um, so, what would you see? I'm just going to switch gears here a little bit, and what do you see as the foremost challenges for the international development of the fields of public policy and public administration, say over the next decade?
Um, well, I mean, it's things have really developed in the course of my career and yours and Gilberto's as well. Um, if you go back up, we had done a book on policy analysis in Canada in 2007, I think, and had asked Mike Mintram, who was at that time, who was the head of the policy section of the EPSR, to do a paper on kind of the history of the sort of policy analysis field. And he had looked at this as a movement, right, as a kind of intellectual movement. That is, the kind of realization by some people, mainly in academia, but also practitioners and so on, that the systematic study of public policy could probably result in better policies, better government, better results. And that was kind of the start of the field where you get obviously some like-minded people who are thinking about that. A lot of them at the beginning obviously are economists and they're working for think tanks like the Rand Institute and so on in the US. But that from that kind of seed, you've had this movement grow and expand territorially ever since the late 1950s, early 1960s. And to a certain extent, that's almost complete, which is really interesting because it's a question of sort of what happens afterwards, which is there, but it's not quite complete yet. But you all know this story, right? So you get this movement. If you look at it in terms of, for instance, the development of professional associations or professional schools and so on, very much a U.S. phenomenon, U.S. centered phenomenon. Right up until whatever 1990 or so. Then you get a kind of expansion into sort of like-minded areas, like mainly OECD type democratic systems. So into Europe, Western Europe, especially Canada, Australia, and elsewhere. Then a kind of expansion into Asia, starting in Singapore and then moving out from there. A little bit later, into Eastern Europe and even into kind of Russia for a little while, and so on, but also into Latin America. And most recently, in large, not in large part, but at least somewhat under the aegis of the IPPA, into Africa, which is kind of the last frontier, for that movement. So if we look at that as a whole, it really means that this movement that started off in, Berkeley and a couple of places in California and so on in whatever 1955, by 2025, so 75 years later, has expanded really throughout the world and is continuing to do that. Now, what I look at is the very positive aspect is that, there were some countries that were kind of missed in that process, like the UK. And it's interesting why that was the case. I have some speculations on that. But in any event, even in the UK, we now have schools at Oxford and Cambridge, and there's other schools starting up and so on. So, you've had this kind of horizontal growth. I think we're probably looking at in the next little while, kind of what you might call sort of verticality, right? Where, there are more schools that are developed and that develop in kind of missing countries. So, in Latin America, it might be great in Chile and Argentina and so on, but not in Bolivia, for instance, or Paraguay, but those, are kind of coming along as well. So in terms of, the developments in the field, I would say at present, it's kind of in this consolidation period, right? That this initial sort of expansion has developed. There have been the very rare kind of retrenchments, like in Russia. There may also be some in some African countries and so on, where the military takes over and they're not very fond of the political science community and so on. But they are very much the exception. So I think this kind of movement is kind of completing that horizontal development. And the challenge over the next little while is this kind of intensification and vertical consolidation in the area. Of course, along the way, different associations and networks and so on have grown up, which are facilitating those processes. So we already know about obviously the IPPA, which is really a key one. It plays a very important role there. But there are also these regional ones, the Asia Pacific Public Policy Network, for instance, which is kind of the China network, although it's not officially, but more or less that's what it is. There's the IPPN, which is the India Public Policy Network, which is very active and growing, and the IPPA, the International Association, has supported the development of those organizations. And they're very much now kind of self-sustaining, and they're moving along. And, they act as a kind of intensifier, but also a conduit for people who are in those areas who may start off doing something with the India Association, for instance, and then get involved in the IPPA and move around from there. So, I mean, there are challenges, in doing that, but I'm very optimistic, and I think the record over the past 75 years has been, extremely positive, which reflects, I think, on the sort of strength of the original ideas and the kind of hunger that's out there for better government and better policy, and that's certainly not going away.
Thank you. So what is your advice to scholars at the beginning of their public policy and or public administration careers? When you've had a career now for about 35 years or so, is it about that now? Or
Right.
yeah.
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I have kind of two ways of looking at that, right? So one is, what would I like to do, or what would I have liked to do if I was a PhD student now, knowing what I know now after having worked in this for the area? But then also, what's the kind of advice that it just give to like PhD students, for instance, generally, when they're starting off in the field. I mean, what I usually say to the students is something like, well, one is don't get discouraged, obviously, in the usual sort of thing that we all say. But I would say, work sectorally, but think generally, right? Or think generically. So what a lot of us have done, we start off in some area. Obviously, Gilberto was working in education. You were working in agriculture and trade and so on. I was working in forestry and natural resources. But that the thing to do is to use that sectoral interest or that specific interest as a kind of entryway to think more broadly and more generically about public policy issues, about larger issues around, state and society relations and the nature of the state and so on, and not to just get bogged down, in the weeds or, the forestry metaphor, to get lost in the woods, and focus too much on the trees, when you're there. You probably remember, in your European philosophical tradition, the work that people like Vico and Gadamer did and so on. They always talk about a hermeneutic circle, and the epistemological problem being, which comes first, knowledge of the whole versus the knowledge of the part, and how do you do it? I think in the policy area, it's better to do the part first and then use that as an entry point to get towards the whole, rather than try to do the other way around. And in that sense, it doesn't really matter what the entry point is. So if it's education, if it's trade, if it's health, if it's wealth, whatever the problem area is, it doesn't really matter, as long as you sort of don't get bogged down in that area and you keep thinking about what the larger issues are. So that way you can use that kind of knowledge of the part to move up to think more about the whole. As far as what I would have done, or what I would have liked to have seen done in those areas, I think, for me, and I get this, talking every time to my students and so on. I think if you look at the kind of, the stages of the policy cycle and so on, however you interpret them or whatever, there's a lot of work done on agenda setting. So it's not that it's done, but there are concepts and theories and models and so on in there. Formulation, there really wasn't, but now there is. And so, with the design literature and so on, a lot of it is focusing on formulation. Decision making, there's always been a lot of literature on that in a whole wide variety of fields. Implementation, obviously, that's the core subject area in public administration and public management and so on. So there's tons of information on that. But evaluation is still, I think, a problem. And I notice in the Canadian context, for instance, just in my kind of day-to-day life, um, and the government doesn't evaluate anything, or if they evaluate something, they ignore the results and they just go along. Like we've just had several experiments here, for instance, with decriminalizing serious drugs, right, of various kinds, and those generally were considered a failure, and they've kind of shut down. Well, there's been zero evaluation of that, either, in the press or what we used to do. There would be a parliamentary committee or a royal commission or something, that would look into that. And that's just not done anymore. So, things, they start up, they shut down, that's it, and move on to the next one. Guy Peters was in one of his more recent works, was talking about zombie policies and things like that. Well, one of the reasons you have zombie policies is if you never evaluate the results, and they just keep coming up again. It's you can just, I imagine here, for instance, 10 years from now, somebody will say, hey, what about decriminalize the drug? And you'll just do the same thing, over and over again. So, if there was more emphasis on that, I think, we'd have better learning, better lesson drawing, and so on. And I'm curious. I have some speculations, but I'm kind of curious about why that's the case. When you and I both started Grace, for instance, you'll recall that it was very common to have royal commissions, for instance, in Canada, in the UK, in Australia. It's still reasonably common in Australia. They're not done in Canada anymore, really, either at the provincial or the federal level. And those were devices that were very important, especially to go back to the forestry case. When you're looking at introduction of new ideas and paradigm shifts and so on, and the punctuation was usually one of these royal commissions. So there really was a kind of learning ethos, and the institutions to manage that were put into place, and those don't exist anymore. So I would, if it was me starting over, I'd be interested in that question. Whether the students are interested in that or not, I don't know.
So policy evaluation, but you also said that you think it's important for somebody beginning their career to have a sectoral area that they focus on, look at the part rather than the more generic concepts. So would there be a substantive policy area that would really interest you today, or are they the same ones that you've always been interested in, natural resources, forestry policy, environmental policy, or would there be something else that you think would pique your interest if you were, starting out as a fresh, and that would also be kind of filling a huge gap in the literature, something where you could marry the policy evaluation interest with a kind of particular sectoral policy?
Uh, well, not really. But this is a difference with, obviously, if you've been doing this for 40 years as opposed to if you're just starting, right? I tend to view these things as cases. So they're, regardless of what it is, it's a case. So if it's health policy in Ecuador, or if it's social policy in California or whatever, it's a case, right? And what does that case tell you? And I'm interested in more of these larger questions around, like, the whole, right? So what does that tell? What do these cases tell you about policy instruments? What does it tell you about policy capacity? What does it tell you about policy design? Something like that. The students, even, at the PhD level, even generally speaking, can't do that, right? Because they don't have enough information on the details of the cases. And they may have a fairly, not superficial, but a kind of surface level idea about what some of the key concepts are, and so on. And the virtuous thing, for them to do is to really drill down into a case. So whatever, it really doesn't matter what it is, right? Whatever the case is, who's doing this, right? How are they organized? What are they doing? Where are they doing it? What are they thinking about? What kind of ideas do they have? This kind of thing. And you can only get that by, picking a case or two or three or whatever, and really drilling down into it for a couple of years, even if it's AI assisted and you're going through, thousands and millions of pages EU documents, over the past 10 or 15 years or something, you really still have to do that kind of legwork so that then you can come back and sort of pull back and start to think about what the implications of that are for the larger picture, right? So, I mean, I don't think you can just start off by saying, the automobile sector in North America has low policy capacity. You've got to establish that first, right? And you have to look, maybe they do, maybe they don't, right? Maybe they had high at one point, it's lower now, maybe it's higher now than it was before. But that's something that you can only get by really doing that kind of field work or legwork. And, that's really what, in my mind, anyway, that's what PhD programs are really about.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I don't have any other questions for you. Gilberto, does anything cropped up that you want to pursue? Your
I
speaker's
have
off.
a small question, in the sense it's a huge question, but exactly because after an hour, maybe you can. It's about politics, Mike, in the sense that, uh, we also had together a challenge with a colleague talking about the instruments and say that your theorization about policy instruments is substantially apolitical. And so the point that you could, for 2 minutes, deal with is what about politics in your view, in your analytical view of public policy? I know it's a huge question, but just
Right. Well, I mean, I should be insulted, as a political scientist to be told that
no,
I
I know,
don't.
I know.
But that's actually, of course, the argument that many of us used to make about economists, right? That the economists who were working in public policy ignored politics, or they had simplistic views of what politics was all about. Reducing it to budget maximization or electoral advantage or something like that. And so, to a certain extent, everything that I've ever done, I've always been thinking of it as having a very heavy and significant political component. The problem that you kind of get into, though, of course, is more, I guess, a sort of administrative one more than anything else, which has to do with, the relationship between sort of political decision making and kind of administrative decision making, and one of them having a kind of technocratic component or a technical component that the other one might not have, right? And so it's a matter of kind of reconciling these things. One of the reasons why I always liked the instrument literature was because I always thought, well, that's really in a way what it did, right, and what it does. When I started, I don't know about you folks, but when I started, a lot of what was being done, as I said, there were no public policy programs, there were public administration programs, but the political science community in Canada, for instance, was mainly interested in what I would call, my colleagues will not like this, but I would call, the minutiae of party behavior and electoral behavior and voter behavior. And somebody, I think it was Hecklo or whatever in the US, had written, well, this is kind of an input-oriented view of public policy making, right? In the sense that you're kind of in this infinite regress, back towards the voter or whatever, to try to understand how, some slight changes in the preference of voters would lead to changes in the political discourses and so on, electoral discourses, which would then result in significant changes in the legislature and so on, which then would lead ultimately to sort of changes in outputs. I always found that those links were very indirect and not particularly useful. And one of the things I liked about the instrument perspective, which is what Solomon argued it did, was it was really starting from the other end, right? So it was looking at the outputs and saying, can we trace those outputs back into these areas? And what it means is that you focus more on aspects like the formulation, well, the process aspects like formulation and decision making and so on, rather than always going back to electoral behavior and voter behavior and things like that. So I don't think that the instrument's perspective, such it is overly technocratic. I think it has a political component. It can certainly be treated in a very technical way. Grace may not know that Gilberto and I are working on a small publication right now, which is looking at the kind of micro level dimensions of policy, right? Of policy tools like calibrations and specifications and so on, and arguing that those aspects have been neglected for a number of reasons in the past, and that it's a very important kind of gap in the literature, but also a gap in thinking that there should be more attention paid to those that level of analysis and those level of components. And one of the arguments that we're making is that in many cases, much of the political discourse or political arguments or whatever are kind of deflected into that level rather than resolved at a kind of higher macro or kind of meso level. So in that sense, I think what we're arguing is that again, politics are intrinsic to tools. It may be kind of disguised, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. But again, when you drill down or when you dig into it, then there's no question that the political component is a significant aspect of not just the kind of tool choice, but also this choice of specifications and targets and specific measures, on the ground.
Okay, hi, Mike. Yeah, I want to just complete the question of Giliberto about politics. So, as Ellen Ingram says, the elephant of the corner is a democracy. So we know that it was in the beginning of the project of Laswell, and you spoke how it was important now to discuss all over the world about the policies, the policy tools, the policy design, but in the same time, the democracy is not really go up, contrary to what probably Laswell hoped was the development of knowledge about policy help maybe the project of democracy. So you have work on different kind of country, even some of them was not democratic. So politics is everywhere, but the question of the link between policy and the political regime it's another way to speak about universality without the question only about cultural context. How you can consider it today, and specifically in this crazy time of even some democracy don't really work as a democracy. And I think so I would like to continue this question of politics about discussing about democracy and public policy, maybe to finish the purpose.
Right. Well, I mean, a couple of years ago, I think Philippe was involved in this project as well, but Les Powell and some of his colleagues had put together a collection of articles on the future of the policy sciences and future of policy studies. And Daryl Jarvis, who I was working with at Singapore at the time, drafted up a paper that I was involved with, and I wish I could take credit for this title, but it was Daryl's idea. He really gets it. Anyway, it was called Beyond Self-Congratulatory Virtue Signaling, and I think that was rather an important point, and it ties in with what Philippe was just asking, but what Daryl was reflecting on was a number of things. One had to do with, the same process that we had just been talking about the growth of policy schools and policy movement and so on. And, the view that I was giving you, which is, what I think a very positive kind of view that this is a great thing and it's moving forward and so on. And Daryl was commenting, well, you have to watch out about being a little too Panglossian about this kind of thing. And that he was concerned about, for instance, as the vice dean of a policy school, that for instance, there were kind of dangers lurking in the woods, right? And one of them, for instance, was business schools, and that the business schools had started to move into the public policy field, uh, and that business schools had moved into other fields in the past. And given the nature of student demand and given the nature of university funding and so on, that they had been very successful in kind of taking over areas that used to be, the purview of other departments, like, for instance, business ethics, things like that, that used to be part of, philosophy department. So he was saying, we should be examining that, why is this happening? What is it about student demand? What is it about job prospects and so on? It's dealing with that. But there was another element to that argument as well, which was more at the macro level, which was making, I think, precisely the point that Philip was making, which is, Lasswell called this, the policy sciences of democracy. And there's clearly, a link to democratic processes, not just in, where the field started, but also kind of how it's developed since then. And one of the things that Daryl and I were talking about in the article was, the problems of just kind of assuming that the democratic backbone or the democratic institutions and procedures that were in place, allowing the kind of policy analysis movement or the policy sciences to move forward, that they would remain, in place, or that there wouldn't be, democratic backsliding or things like, the Hungarian government shutting down the CEU and which was kind of one of the leaders in the policy field, obviously in Central and Eastern Europe. The advent of the Trump government, I think, this is not a surprise to anyone, or shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. That has led to all kinds of questions about even the commitment of the U.S. to various kind of democratic processes and practices. In my own mind, it's forced me to go back and, read Juan Linz again, and think about what is authoritarianism and what are the different kinds of authoritarianism and so on. And, how do the policy sciences relate to authoritarianism, to democracy, seen as Philip was saying, seen as, different political regimes. And how much of the kind of progress of policy sciences has been due to its links to this democratic underpinning, how much of that can survive lesser kind of democratic elements, like in Hungary and possibly and so on, or can it flourish in non-democratic systems? And there are some interesting cases on either regard, like Thailand, for instance, where you have the kind of flourishing of the field, but under a military regime. But I think it's a very important question, a question that requires a lot more thought than I've given it, and I'm sure that it will be the subject, especially given the activities of the Trump government and their high profile. It will be the subject of discussion for maybe decades, but certainly for years to come.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, the only thing that I always have to mention, but really should mention, is that whatever I've done to whatever extent that I've done it, has been done with a lot of colleagues. And absolutely, you were asking, what would some of the advice for PhD students be and so on. Well, one of them would be, to get some good colleagues and work with good colleagues. And, I've been very fortunate and, to have excellent colleagues, both from my UBC days, from Queens, from the time I was in Singapore, from elsewhere. And, absolutely couldn't have done really anything without them. It's really been a pleasure. It's great to work with people who are, very professional, critical thinkers and enthusiastic and full of ideas about what to look at and why it's interesting and how to look at it. And, 80% of the time, it's something that I haven't thought of before and wouldn't have thought of without them. And so I would be remiss not to thank each and every one of them for having done that. And that includes obviously kind of professional colleagues, but also students or former students that I've worked with, and it's really been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Mike. And I think we can leave it there. And congratulations again on your career award from the International Public Policy Association.
Thank you.